The little German shepherd sat trembling in the corner of the shelter, tears streaking down his face as people walked past without a second glance. His ribs faintly showed beneath his fur, his eyes empty, like he'd already given up on being loved. Then one man stopped. He wasn't planning to adopt. He'd only come to look. But when the puppy raised his paw, placing it gently against the man's hand, something inside him broke. It wasn't just pity, it was connection. He didn't know why, but he couldn't walk away. What he didn't realize was that this tiny act of compassion would uncover a secret buried deep in the past and lead to a moment that would leave everyone speechless. Before we start, make sure to hit like, share, and subscribe. And really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. The sky was overcast that morning, a thin drizzle painting the streets in shades of gray as Daniel parked his old pickup outside the city animal shelter. He wasn't sure why he'd come, maybe curiosity, maybe something else. But as he stepped through the shelter doors, a wave of loneliness seemed to hit him all at once. The faint smell of disinfectant mixed with the soft, desperate sounds of barking echoed through the halls. Every cage held a pair of pleading eyes, each one silently asking the same question, "Will you take me home?" A volunteer approached him with a tired but kind smile. "Looking to adopt?" she asked. Daniel hesitated, his hands buried in his jacket pockets. "Just looking," he replied softly. But even as he said it, his eyes were already wandering, drawn deeper into the corridor lined with metal bars and trembling tails. He passed dogs of every size and color, some hopeful, some broken. Then from the last enclosure, a quiet whimper made him stop. A small German shepherd pup sat in the corner, motionless, his head bowed low. Unlike the others, he didn't bark or wag his tail. Instead, he simply stared at the floor as if waiting for someone who'd never return. Something in that stillness tugged at Daniel's heart. He didn't know it yet, but this moment, this single glance, was about to change both their lives forever. Daniel crouched beside the cage, his eyes meeting the puppy's for the first time. The small German shepherd didn't move. He just stared, his wet eyes wide and glassy, reflecting the dim fluorescent light above. A faint trail of dried tears ran down his soft fur, and when Daniel whispered gently, "Hey, buddy, it's okay," the puppy only blinked as if unsure whether kindness was real. Other dogs barked for attention, but this one stayed still, quiet, fragile, broken. His tiny paw shifted slightly forward, trembling, before he hesitantly placed it against the cold metal bars. The gesture was so soft, so human, that Daniel's throat tightened. "You've been through something, haven't you?" he murmured. A volunteer passing by paused. "That's Shadow," she said softly. "He doesn't eat much, barely moves. We think he's waiting for his old owner, but they're not coming back." Her voice cracked at the end. Daniel felt something stir deep inside, a mix of sorrow and determination. He didn't know this dog, didn't know his story, but he could feel the weight of it. Shadow's eyes weren't just sad. They were pleading for one last chance. Daniel exhaled slowly and whispered, "You're not going to wait alone anymore." And for the first time, Shadow blinked, and his tiny tail moved just once, as if hope had flickered back to life. The volunteer, a middle-aged woman named Karen, sighed and leaned against the wall, her eyes softening as she looked at Shadow. "He came in about 3 weeks ago," she began quietly. "Someone found him tied to a fence on the edge of town. No food, no collar, just a frayed rope and a note." Daniel frowned. "A note?" She nodded. "It said, 'Please forgive me. I have no choice.' That's all." Karen knelt beside the cage, slipping her fingers through the bars. Shadow didn't flinch. He just pressed his paw gently against her hand. "We tried everything to cheer him up," she continued. "Toys, treats, even other dogs. But he just waits. Every morning he looks toward the door like he's expecting someone to walk in." Her voice softened. "He doesn't bark. He doesn't whine. Just waits." Daniel's gaze lingered on the pup's drooping ears and sorrowful eyes. "Did anyone try tracing the owner?" he asked. Karen shook her head. "No microchip, no name. It's like he appeared out of nowhere." A lump formed in Daniel's throat. The image of that lonely little dog waiting day after day clawed at his heart. He could almost imagine Shadow sitting in the cold, wondering what he'd done wrong. Karen exhaled sadly. "Most people overlook him," she whispered. "They think he's too broken to heal. Daniel stared at the trembling puppy and murmured, "Maybe he's not broken. Maybe he just needs someone to believe in him again." Daniel stood in silence, his hands tightening around the metal bars. He had come to the shelter just to look, but now he couldn't tear his eyes away from the fragile creature staring back at him. A dozen thoughts tangled in his mind. He lived alone, worked long hours, barely managed his own loneliness. Could he really care for a dog this broken? Shadow's paw remained pressed against the cage, trembling slightly, his gaze unwavering. Daniel felt something stir in his chest, a strange pull he hadn't felt in years. "You remind me of someone," he whispered without realizing it. His voice was thick, weighted with memories he rarely let surface. Karen watched him quietly. "You don't have to decide today," she said gently. But Daniel didn't answer. His eyes stayed locked on Shadow, who for the first time lifted his head and gave a faint whine. Not loud, not desperate, just hopeful. The sound hit Daniel like a punch to the heart. He swallowed hard, torn between fear and compassion. He had lost people before. He knew what it felt like to give your heart and watch it break. Did he have the strength to do it again? Finally, he exhaled, voice barely a whisper. "Maybe I didn't come here by accident." Shadow tilted his head, ears twitching, and in that quiet shelter, something unspoken passed between man and dog. A fragile beginning neither of them fully understood yet. Daniel lingered near the cage long after everyone else had moved on. The shelter had grown quieter now. Distant barking had softened into a low hum. Shadow still sat watching him, ears drooping, tail motionless. Something inside Daniel refused to let him walk away. He finally turned to Karen, his voice steady but uncertain. "What do I need to do? To take him home?" Karen blinked in surprise, then smiled gently. "You sure?" she asked. Daniel nodded once. "Yeah, I think he's been waiting long enough." She led him to the small office near the lobby, the walls covered with pictures of happy adoptions, people smiling, dogs wagging their tails. As Daniel filled out the paperwork, he couldn't help glancing at those photos, wondering if Shadow would ever look that happy. Each signature felt heavier than the last, like a silent promise. When he handed the forms back, Karen's eyes softened. "You just gave him a second chance," she said quietly. Moments later, she returned with Shadow in her arms. The puppy clung tightly to her shirt, trembling. Daniel reached out a cautious hand, and after a pause, Shadow pressed his tiny paw against it. The same gesture from before. Karen smiled. "Looks like he already chose you." Daniel swallowed hard, emotion rising in his chest. "Then let's go home, buddy," he whispered. And for the first time, Shadow's tail wagged, faintly, uncertainly. But it was a beginning. The drive home was quiet, too quiet. Shadow sat in the passenger seat, his small frame pressed against the door, eyes fixed on the rain-smeared window. Daniel glanced at him occasionally, expecting curiosity or excitement, but there was none. The puppy didn't whine, didn't move. He just stared, his reflection flickering against the glass like a ghost. When they reached home, Daniel opened the door, motioning him inside. Shadow hesitated on the threshold, paws frozen on the welcome mat, as if uncertain he was allowed to enter. "It's okay, buddy," Daniel said softly. After a long pause, Shadow stepped in. Slow, cautious, like every movement was a test. Daniel laid out a blanket, some food, and a small water bowl. Shadow sniffed the bowl, then turned away, curling into a corner. His breathing was shallow, his eyes half shut but restless, as if haunted by unseen memories. Later that night, Daniel heard faint whimpers echoing from the living room. When he peeked in, Shadow was trembling in his sleep, paws twitching, tail tucked tightly between his legs. A nightmare. Daniel knelt beside him, whispering, "You're safe now, boy." But even in sleep, Shadow didn't seem to believe it. His tiny body shook harder, and Daniel realized whatever this puppy had endured, it hadn't ended at the shelter's gate. It had followed him home. That night, the house felt different. The steady hum of the refrigerator, the ticking clock on the wall. Everything sounded louder, emptier. Daniel sat on the couch, watching the little bundle of fur curled tightly in the corner of the living room. Shadow hadn't touched his food, hadn't moved much since they arrived. He just lay there, eyes open, staring at nothing. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're safe now, you know that?" he murmured. But the puppy didn't react. The only sign of life was the slow rise and fall of his chest. Daniel turned on a small lamp, casting a soft amber glow across the room. You can sleep, buddy. No one's gonna hurt you here. Hours passed. The rain outside deepened into a steady rhythm against the window. Daniel dozed off on the couch, half awake, half listening. Then a faint sound made him open his eyes, a quiet whimper like a broken whisper. Shadow was dreaming again, his paws twitching, tiny whines escaping between breaths. Daniel got up, knelt beside him, and gently placed a hand near the puppy's head. It's okay, he whispered, voice barely audible. Slowly the trembling eased. Shadow shifted slightly closer to him, his breathing softening. It wasn't trust yet, not even comfort, but it was a beginning. And as the storm raged outside, a fragile peace settled in that small, quiet room, shared between two lonely souls learning to heal. The next morning, pale sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting soft stripes across the floor. Shadow was still curled near the couch, fast asleep. Daniel moved quietly around the kitchen, preparing breakfast, the smell of coffee and toast filling the air. When he turned back toward the puppy, something caught his eye, a faint glint of metal beneath the fur around Shadow's neck. Curious, Daniel knelt down. Hey, what's that you've got there? He murmured, gently parting the fur. Tucked behind the worn collar was a small rusted tag, not the kind the shelter usually used. It was oval-shaped, scratched from wear, and attached with a tiny piece of string that looked hastily tied. Daniel carefully unclipped it, turning it over in his palm. On the back was a faded photograph sealed beneath a thin plastic cover. It was old, water-stained, but still visible. A young boy, maybe 10 years old, hugging a much smaller version of Shadow. The smile on the boy's face was wide, pure, full of love. Beneath it, barely legible, were the words, Max, my best friend forever. Daniel stared at it for a long moment, his chest tightening. So your name used to be Max, he whispered. Shadow lifted his head slightly, ears twitching at the familiar word. For a brief second, his tail moved, a tiny flicker of recognition. Daniel's mind filled with questions. Who was the boy? What had happened? And why had they been separated? The discovery of the photo lingered in Daniel's mind all day. He couldn't focus on anything else. That little picture, the boy's smile, the handwriting, the word forever, felt like a promise that had been broken. After lunch, he sat at his desk with the tag beside him, tracing the edges with his thumb. Who were you waiting for, buddy? He murmured, glancing toward Shadow, who lay quietly by the window, eyes half closed in the sunlight. Daniel decided to call the shelter. Karen answered, her voice warm but weary. Hey, it's Daniel, he said. I found something around Shadow's collar, a tag with a photo of a boy. Do you have any record of who brought him in? There was a pause. Not really, Karen replied. Just the note we told you about, but wait. Paper rustled on her end. There was a mention on the intake report. A woman dropped him off, said he belonged to her nephew who passed away last year. Daniel froze. Passed away? He repeated softly. Yeah, Karen sighed. She didn't say much else. Just that she couldn't keep the dog after that. Daniel looked over at Shadow. The pup's ears twitched as if he somehow understood. Suddenly, the sadness in his eyes made sense. He wasn't just abandoned. He was grieving. Daniel swallowed hard, whispering to himself, You didn't lose hope. You lost someone. And in that moment, the mystery stopped being about finding answers. It became about helping a broken heart heal. That evening, Daniel couldn't shake the image of the boy in the photo. The more he stared at it, the clearer the story became. A child who had loved this puppy deeply, and a loss so painful it left a scar even on an animal's heart. He opened his laptop and searched local news archives, typing in a few words. Boy, German Shepherd puppy, accident. After a few minutes of scrolling, a headline made his breath catch. Local boy age 10 dies saving his dog from oncoming car. Daniel clicked it, his pulse quickening. The article described how the boy, Ethan Miller, had rushed into the street to save his puppy from a runaway vehicle. The dog survived. The boy didn't. Daniel sat frozen, his heart aching. He looked down at Shadow, who lay quietly beside his chair, gazing up with those same sorrowful eyes. You were that dog, Daniel whispered. You were Max. He picked up the old photo again. It was the same boy, Ethan, his arm around a younger Shadow. "He died for you," Daniel murmured, his voice trembling. "And you never stopped waiting for him." Shadow tilted his head as if hearing his name in the past, then softly whined, pressing closer to Daniel's leg. In that fragile silence, man and dog shared something deeper than words. The weight of grief, and the beginning of understanding that love, once given, never truly dies. The next day, Daniel decided to visit the address mentioned in the article, the boy's old home. It was a small, worn-down house at the edge of town, with a white fence now chipped and fading. As he parked outside, Shadow perked up for the first time, ears twitching, tail flicking nervously. Daniel frowned. "You remember this place, don't you?" he whispered. They walked up the narrow path, leaves crunching underfoot. Before Daniel could knock, the door opened. An elderly woman stood there, her eyes weary but kind. "Can I help you?" she asked softly. Daniel hesitated, holding out the small photo tag. "Ma'am, I think this belonged to your grandson." Her breath caught. She took the tag with trembling hands, eyes filling with tears as she looked at the picture. "Ethan," she whispered. Her gaze dropped to the German shepherd at Daniel's side. Shadow whimpered softly, then stepped forward, his tail low but wagging, eyes wide with recognition. The woman fell to her knees, her voice breaking. "Max, is that really you?" Shadow barked once in a sharp emotional sound to her and rushed into her arms. She wept, clutching his fur, whispering her grandson's name over and over. Daniel felt his throat tighten, the scene before him raw and beautiful. It wasn't just a reunion. It was healing, for a grandmother who lost her grandson, for a dog who lost his boy, and for a man who learned that love can find its way home. Tears streamed down the old woman's cheeks as she held Shadow close, her frail hands trembling against his fur. "He waited for Ethan every day," she whispered. Even when we couldn't bear to look at his bed." Her voice cracked, but there was a hint of peace beneath the pain. Shadow leaned into her embrace, his eyes soft, his tail wagging gently as if recognizing the warmth he had lost so long ago. Daniel stood quietly nearby, his heart heavy, yet full. For the first time since he'd met the little dog, the emptiness in Shadow's eyes seemed to fade. This was where his story began, and maybe where it could finally rest. The woman looked up at Daniel, smiling through her tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "You gave him back his family, and maybe a part of mine too." Daniel shook his head. "No," he said softly. "He gave me something I didn't even know I needed, a reason to feel again." Shadow trotted over to Daniel, pressing his nose against his palm. It wasn't the fearful, trembling touch from before. It was trust. The sun dipped low behind the old house, painting everything in a soft golden hue. For a moment the world felt still. No grief, no distance, just connection. And as Daniel drove home that evening, Shadow rested his head on his lap, finally at peace. The weeks that followed felt like watching spring bloom after a long, harsh winter. The once fearful puppy who had hidden in corners now chased sunlight across the living room floor. Shadow, no Max as Daniel often called him now, ran through the backyard with unrestrained joy, his fur gleaming in the golden light. Every bark carried life, every tail wag spoke of healing. Daniel couldn't help but smile every time he looked at him. The dog that once trembled at Shadows now greeted neighbors with bright, eager eyes. He'd learned to trust again, to believe that love didn't always end in loss. In many ways, Daniel felt the same. Sometimes they visited Ethan's grandmother. She'd sit on the porch with Max beside her, gently scratching behind his ears, whispering stories of the boy who had loved him first. Max would listen quietly, his eyes soft, as though he understood every word. Daniel often watched from a distance, knowing that between the two, an old woman and a once broken dog, there existed a love that transcended time. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, Max placed his paw on Daniel's knee, looking up with the same soulful eyes from the day they met. But now there was no sadness left in them, only peace, trust, and something deeper. He was home. Some stories don't end where they began. They find new meaning through love that refuses to die. Shadow's journey wasn't just about rescue. It was about rediscovery, a reminder that even the saddest hearts can heal when given a second chance. Daniel didn't just save a dog. He saved himself too. And somewhere beyond this world, a boy named Ethan was surely smiling, knowing his best friend had finally found home again. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales of hope. loyalty and unconditional love.